Hello, welcome to part 3 of the Twinless Twins series. This time we have Reverend Kate Spellman. We met each other in Philadelphia when we were both working at Christ Church. Shout out to Christ Church. I worked there for I want to say 5-6 years. I don't remember what year you came in, but it was like an instant, I want to be her friend. And then I helped you move to Chicago before I moved to Ecuador. You've been part of my life for very pivotal moments, huge breakups, meeting my husband, all that stuff. You were a big part of my life, still are, just there's distance, a lot of distance. And then COVID happened. But why I wanted to talk to you for this series is because as a reverend, you have led countless people through a death in their family or in their life. I wanted to talk to you about ways you coach people through that. You have a certain perspective, and then not necessarily a religious one, but a certain perspective of just how to deal with that grief and how to think about the people that are no longer around.
My name is Kate. I've known Amy, I think since 2011. That's when I first showed up at Christ Church. Mm-hmm. And like you said, it was just an instant connection. I was like, I want to be friends with this girl. She's cool as hell. Been through some pretty pivotal life events, breakups and dating to get married. It's just been a real pleasure to know you. You're very, very special to me. And by extension, Pedro and Olivia are very, very special to me. I still remember when you guys first met and you were like, I met somebody who online dating is terrible and total trash, right? But then suddenly there was this guy named Pedro who was just incredibly decent and understood what it meant to be an artist and wanted to be a parent. And it just, at least for me, there was kind of no question. I was like, this is the guy. So I'm ordained in the Episcopal Church. I describe it a lot as being it's politically very progressive, very leftist. So we ordain women, we recognize LGBT same-sex or same-gender unions and ordain people. We ordain trans folks, kind of liturgically conservative. So we have most of the parts that you would expect from a Roman Catholic Mass as a part of our service, including weekly communion, the communion. I have done, sad to say, but I have done a fair number of funerals in my life. That's a moment when people really, I think, understand that they need ritual or want to be connected to something bigger, or even just have a space to bring people together. Sometimes that's because they're religious. Sometimes it's just because they have a feeling that they want to do something. The first funeral that I did at Christ Church, the woman was, she was Asian American. She was the product of an American GI who had been serving in East Asia and had gotten married. So she herself wasn't religious. She had some kind of Buddhist leanings. And she'd also donated her body to science. So there was not a body or any kind of remains. It ended up being, I think my liturgy professor from seminary would have turned up his nose at what we produced, but it ended up being a really beautiful and moving service. And I'm thankful to some mentors in my life who really talked to me through what it means to be with people through death. I'm here because I am happy to talk about your 2 babies.
Definitely part of something I need to figure out. Am I still a mom of twins? The first thing I wanted to talk about is the word lost, because lost has this sort of blame attached to it. I lost her, I lost her in the grocery store or something, or I wasn't looking and I lost her. That feeling of blame sort of led to legit the first 6 months of Olivia's life, I had to be in the same room with her or Pedro. How dare I leave her in a room by herself? And the midwife really snuck in there and blew my mind a little bit. And she was like, well, of course, that's because when you weren't looking, one of your kids was taken away from you. So I didn't know if you had discussions with people because I have trouble with the word, because it feels like it was all on me, because who else's fault would it be? She was in my body. And why didn't I know? Why didn't I know there was something wrong? I guess I wanted to talk to you about, do you use a different word from lost, or has other people who you're leading through this process used another word?
I will say I've never known somebody to have such a strong reaction to the word, but I do think that I understand where you're coming from. Totally, 100% makes sense to me. I frequently have people use a lot of euphemistic language, right? That's what it is. It's a euphemism instead of saying she died, right? So people will say like so-and-so passed. I'm quite active in the LGBT community. And so one time somebody called me and said that their mother had transitioned, and it was very early in the morning. And the first thing I thought was that her mother had come out as a transgender man. And I was like, didn't see that coming. She's in her 80s. And then through the conversation, then began to understand that the mother had died of a stroke. So I think that's one of the knee-jerk reactions I have with the term lost, is that it's a euphemism. It's not strictly descriptive language. This is ironic, but in writing would be called like a dead metaphor, right? It's a metaphor for something that, and we don't even think of it as a metaphor. I think too, I mean, the kind of like blame and shame that we put on pregnant people, at least in the US, and I think in a lot of other places too, is just incredible. So as people who are pregnant, we're like primed to feel as guilty as possible for everything. So I'm pregnant right now. I'm very early in my pregnancy. I'm using an app to track things. Yeah. And every day it's like asking me a question like, are you getting enough biotin? And I was like, what is biotin? Yeah. Apparently it's in walnuts. I'm not going to sit here and just like eat nothing but walnuts, but it seems like it's just like one more thing that I have to worry about. I've heard some people use the word lost and they like it. Some people will use the word passed away. I guess you can also use the word transition, but be careful of the context you use that in. Right. But I think that especially in talking about that loss with children or with people who don't understand metaphoric language, I wonder about language like that being actually more difficult for them, right? Because you're not telling them a fact, you're kind of telling them a story. And that idea of, well, she's lost, well, then where is she? She must be somewhere if she's lost. We can go find her or something like that. I can see that leading to all kinds of really difficult questions for you, for Ollie, for other people. Mm-hmm. And I'm just, this isn't strong enough language, but I'm really sorry that you feel any type of blame because, it's just what happened. If you had been to blame, if you had been doing something horrible, both of your kids would have died. This is just something that happened. We'll never understand why. You did absolutely everything in your power to keep both of them alive, which is why Olivia is turning 2.
I had everybody in my life sort of say the same thing, that like it wasn't your fault. And when I was, the midwife gave me the statistics of how many twinless twin situations actually happen. And it's pretty low. So I'm at the point in my life, all this happened pre-COVID. All the statistics of like me even getting pregnant with twins was I'm older, so it was increased, but it's still pretty rare. And then losing one, I think only 4% of twin pregnancies result in one of them dying. So once COVID hit, I was like, 2 very rare things happened to me. If I leave this house, I'm getting COVID. I know I am. So I was really cautious. And Olivia, still at this day, we are taping this on June 24th, 2021. Olivia has not been to a restaurant since she was like 8 months old. I still live every day thinking something terrible is going to happen to her, even a freak accident, because her losing her sister was a freak accident. The amount of worry and anxiety that comes along with, and I'm sure it's similar to people who were pregnant with a single and miscarried, if they get pregnant again, an insane amount of anxiety.
And I think any time someone dies, right, especially if they die and I'm using the language of died because I'm trying not to use the word past, and I'd love to hear, once I'm done talking, I want to hear how that feels to you. But anytime someone dies in like a weird circumstance, it like expands your imagination in a way that is maybe not exactly healthy, right? I had a parent die of suicide when I was really pretty young. And it's not something you want to think of as a possibility at all. And yet there it is. It's very different than what you're describing, but I've been like, the way that you're talking about getting COVID, I have felt that way about mental health concerns in my family, for me and for my brother. And it's really, that's not how statistics work. Because something weird happened to you once, it's not going to happen again. Suicide is we don't think transmissible through genetics. It is socially contagious, but you don't inherit it from parents. But it, like, your imagination has suddenly grown to this point where you can see and understand. There's like a whole world of possibilities that other people just can't even conceptualize.
Yeah.
Right.
Even before Elisa died, I had this like worst case scenario. Like if, before I moved out of my parents' house, if my dad was late coming to work, oh, it's because he got in an accident. Or, so I've always had a little bit of that going on, and it just got worse.
When I've gone through, like, especially when I was younger, but in like stressful periods of my life, I would have like dreams about disasters happening. And the point of the dream would always be like calling 911. And when I told somebody about it, they were like, oh, that's good because your brain is rehearsing. Like if something bad happens, I have a plan. This is how I get to the phone and how I call 911. We've done this before. Does it feel like you're worrying, like, is kind of like your brain is running these scenarios in terms of, well, here's what could possibly happen?
I think so. I think there's also an element of, and I don't know if it's the environment I grew up in or not, but people who bad things happened to got a lot of attention. So I felt like it's totally separate from how it would affect me personally, but I always imagined terrible things happening and then telling that terrible thing happening to other people. And I don't know if that just feeds into like just storytelling, because I make art and want to tell stories. And I thank God that nothing terrible ever happened. But yeah, I think that was more of it, because I wanted a story to tell. And I think when you're younger, bad or interesting or crazy things were just the kind of stories that you think people want to hear. And now it's more like,
right,
more mundane, less scary stuff can also be really cool, interesting stories.
Yeah, there's lots of great fiction, right, in which essentially nothing happens and there's like almost no plot. Yeah. But I mean, too, I don't want to discount your anxiety over this stuff, but part of it is that you are very smart, and smart people are good at making up scenarios, right? Like, so you can project yourself into this future scenario because you have the storytelling skills to do it and make it so. It's just hard when you start to live there and instead of in the present moment where you can actually enjoy what's happening in those more mundane things.
When I was growing up and when I started going to therapy in college, because I was so boy crazy and boy sad because no boy ever wanted to date me, that I started going to therapy. But like my entire life, I wanted to feel every feeling possible. And I wanted to like sit in that feeling, whether it was joy or fear or sadness or depression or whatever. Like I just wanted to like feel all of it. But Elisa dying was the first time in my life that I just needed to think about something else, or I didn't want this feeling anymore. And it's crazy to me how, for the most part, being lonely was the feeling I sat in until I met Pedro. Because even the partners I had before Pedro, they were lonely to be with just because a variety.
No shame, but yeah. I saw some of those. They were not Pedro quality.
And I was totally okay being lonely, but feeling like I had done something that killed my child was not a feeling that I wanted to sit in. And I'm sure every human being who has miscarried has needed some sort of distraction or something else to dwell on. Because that's not a healthy. I knew through all my years of therapy that I couldn't sit with that feeling for very long before I, maybe didn't start, or maybe I started treating myself with Olivia still inside me, still needing me to do all the right things. Like I couldn't start drinking, which is not an impulse that I have anyway, but I couldn't, I still couldn't do all these things that like a depressed, sad person maybe would want to do, because
kind of classic self-destructive.
Yeah, because I still had to keep Olivia alive. Speaking of Olivia, at the time when I was pregnant with both, and we were telling everybody, and everybody was so excited, and that sort of feeds into the having an interesting story to tell, right? Like, not only was I pregnant, but I was pregnant with twins. While at the time I was just scared of like, I don't even know how to take care of one. How am I going to take care of two? I got to the happy about it place, but it took a while. But once we did have that sonogram and Elisa's heartbeat had stopped, all these other couples who were pregnant also with twins when I was pregnant with twins, and a couple of them were, because they were lesbian couples, it was done through multiple different, like, I've heard of IVF, but then one of them had a different procedure, which I forget the name of. At any rate, once I found out Elisa had died, I couldn't talk to them anymore. Like, I think the grief was so, and the anger and the jealousy that they have both their twins. And a lot of it played into, well, I live in a third world country, so clearly I wasn't getting the quality healthcare that my friends in the States who gave birth to their twins were getting, which was it was just somewhere to assign blame, because in this situation, there's no one to blame. Right. But at the time, I think I was searching for like, oh, if only I had lived in the States, I would have gotten better healthcare, which is totally false. The healthcare I got was impeccable. And it also only cost us a couple $1,000s down here to have a kid. Whereas if I was in the States, we'd still be in debt. Seeing these other friends with twins, and then just strangers with twins, whether it's on the internet or out and about in Quito, it doesn't anymore, but for a long time, it just felt like a personal attack on me. And I don't think I've done any conscious work to think of them different or stop having that feeling. It just sort of stopped. And I had a conversation with one of those couples. It took about a year until I was like, okay, I do want to see photos of their beautiful children, but it did take me a long time.
From my perspective, it's totally understandable to not want to connect with somebody if you had this shared experience. Like, you kind of all signed up for the same contract, and then your contract was violated in a huge way, and not to want to hang out with, the people who are continuing on happily in their bubble.
And I wonder how many people you've counseled through death that like feel this like resentment towards like the rest of the world for what they're experiencing.
I think it's really common. I mean, I've felt it myself. I know it around fertility issues with friends of mine, right? A friend of mine is a colleague of mine at work is in the adoption process, and she's in the adoption process because nothing has worked for her and her husband. Like, they've done all kinds of fertility treatments. I think her health has they've gotten to a point where they say it's not going to happen for us biologically. And, she was saying, I don't understand why. She's very religious. So she was saying, I don't understand why God would give babies to people who have no way of taking care of them or no interest in taking care of them. And all we want is a child, and we can't have one. We all live in the world like comparing ourselves to each other. To have lost your parent or spouse or sibling, and then see other people with the same parent, spouse, or sibling, you're immediately like, well, what did they do? Or why are they better than me? Or why do they deserve this more than me? I think that's another way our culture is set up, right? Like, we, not just in pregnancy, but a lot of American culture at least leads us to believe that like we're the controllers of our own destiny. If I do good, then I'll receive good. Or if I do this, I can earn this. But death is one of those things that just completely violates that idea, like completely destroys it. But we're still primed to compare ourselves to other people or other situations. I've heard plenty of people say, why my child and not another child? Or even why my child and not me, right? That's another thing I've heard before. Why my spouse? And then my sister's husband, who's a total asshole, recovering alcoholic, like that guy is fine. And my spouse, has cancer or lung disease. I think it's, like you said, like it's primordial anger. The love that we have for people in our families or for people that we love is like one of the most powerful forces in the world. And when that loses its kind of proper channel, it almost immediately turns into grief, rage, anger, jealousy, especially like you said, when there is no one or nothing to blame. There's no proper place to put it, right? But that emotion, like you're describing, is so strong. And you can't keep it in your body just to survive or have your other baby survive. It's got to be directed outwards.
And I've usually had a creative outlet to get those feelings out of my body. And I still do with Elisa. I think I'm in the middle of some creative projects that she's not the center of, but like she's in there because she's still part. And it's hard. I feel like she's still part of my life, but I also don't want Olivia to feel like, I don't know how Olivia is going to feel about it. And that's partly why I wanted to have this conversation, because she could feel that connection and feel like she's missing somebody or not. I don't know if she will ever want to refer to Elisa as her sister, or that I have a twin. Or had a twin. So I guess I'm working through all this and trying to have conversations with people to sort of open up the possibilities for her once she's old enough to understand what happened, so that she can figure out how she wants to talk about Elisa. But I feel like before that happens, I have to figure out how to talk about Elisa so that my mom knows how to talk about Elisa, or my dad, or my mother-in-law. And I'm just not there yet. I want to give all my time and attention to Olivia, who's alive and a handful. but I feel like if I let Elisa be forgotten, then I would feel terrible. So I'm trying to find that balance, and then how to talk about her, which these conversations are really helping me with. And with the creative outlets, like I'm illustrating a children's book now, which is about bullying, because that's something I experienced. A very specific kind of bullying where I was like the artist of my grade. So the popular kids only talked to me when they needed something artistic done, and then I was invisible for the rest of the year. And Olivia and Elisa are twins in that story. Olivia's the one that's going through all the things, and Elisa's just sort of in the background, propping her up when she needs to, and saying she's proud of her and stuff. So that's sort of where Elisa sort of lives in my mind right now, is some sort of voice, but not necessarily a whole person. Because for context, her heart stopped at 17 or 18 weeks. So, definitely didn't have a chance to survive outside of the womb at that point. And she wasn't a fully formed human. But like for the first sort of 6 months of Olivia's life, I just constantly, there should be another one, and they would look exactly alike. But now that Olivia's gotten older and has a personality and talks and stuff, I'm a little less like, oh, there should be an exact replica, because now it's like she's her own person who legit says like, no, I'll do it myself to me all the time. And she does it in Spanish too. It's Olivia sola. So I think the older she gets, the less I imagine Elisa as being this carbon copy. Still figuring out, like I'm doing this children's book, but then I'm doing the next one sort of just is in my brain and hasn't been put on paper or anything, but it's gonna be, I want it to be a nonfiction story about a twin who loses their twin. But I feel like I need to live that for a little bit longer before I actually write it. So I do have these creative outlets, which I don't know where I'd be mentally if I didn't have those.
I have to say that I really admire you for thinking about these things, because I think a lot of people feel the natural temptation, like you said, to just feel something else, right? And to not talk about Elisa, or, not tell Olivia. I'm sure there are people who like made it into their 20s before they found out that they had, a sibling who died. I went to seminary with someone who she was quite a bit older, obviously. So she had a baby when she was too young, and the classic scenario of she wasn't offered a choice and the baby was given up for adoption. And when her kids were teenagers, she basically had to tell them that they had a sibling because the other girl was coming looking for her birth mom. I don't want to be a douche, but I do want to remind you that one of the things about grief is that it's kind of unpredictable. I know a lot of people experience kind of a fresh wave or a different wave of grief at different milestones, right? So I can imagine, every time Olivia has a birthday or if she goes to school, or projecting way ahead, right? She has her first kiss, wants to get married, wants to have her own kid. Some part of you is going to think about Elisa, and always will. We want to say in a metaphorical sense, oh, she's always a part of you. But I also found out, this is old news to you, but like that when you're pregnant, your baby's DNA is in your blood. Like that's bonkers, right? So like they're literally a part of you. Were Olivia and Elisa identical or fraternal?
I don't know if we know that.
Okay.
They did have their own placenta and their own sacs and everything. So they could have been, they could have not been identical because of that, I think. I'll have to check on that. I'm not sure if that's something.
But my point is like they whether they were identical or fraternal, they share so much DNA that, they'll always be a part of each other because it's just written into their, like the very atoms in their bodies. And I also appreciate, right, like you're making space for Olivia's going to have her own story, and it might be different from your story, might be different from Pedro's story. She might feel a completely different way. We don't know that yet because Olivia solo is her most frequent sentence at this point.
Yeah.
I know in a lot of families, even when one person dies, there's a constellation of different stories about it, right? How people feel, how they felt about that person, whatever they had unresolved with that person. And I also know, I've told you this before, but I have a friend who he's in his early 50s. And at one point he was talking about his brother. And I said, oh, I didn't know you had a brother. And he said, oh, I had a twin brother who died in utero. Mm-hmm. And he was just raised knowing about his brother. He doesn't have stories from growing up with his brother, but he feels very strongly connected, and he feels like he has a sibling. He just has a sibling who's passed away.
Yeah.
Who's died. We just don't know what Olivia is going to be like. And we also don't know kind of at this point what the shape of your family is going to be like, whether you guys are going to be successful in pursuing adoption, or when or how that's going to feel right for you.
I can't even fathom not telling Olivia that she had a sister. I don't know when it's going to happen. And I also feel like she's a very visual kid. I can tell that already, because it's taking her a little bit longer to speak just because of the bilingual stuff. And I think she in her brain, she's trying to decipher English, Spanish. We speak English to her mostly at home, but then she goes out to daycare and it's Spanish. I think they do like one class a week where it's English. So she's slower at talking, and she's not doing full sentences yet. But we bought her this like sign language book, and in one night we read through that book like 5 times, and she knew all the signs. Mom, dad, sleepy, water, like she knew all of them. So I do think that she's going to be a visual learner, which I am. I guess I'm waiting for myself the children's books are underway. I feel like when I do introduce Elisa to her, she needs to have taken some form. Because I remember...
You need a visual.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Because the one thing, not saying that Olivia is going to think the exact same way I think, but I had a suicide in the family. And because we weren't a religious family, or at least my mom and dad weren't, I think. My mom's parents, I don't know if they were religious, but they went to church, because that's what you do when you live in the South, whether you're religious or not. They didn't make us go to church. We did at our grandparents' behest, but it didn't last very long. So I just didn't have, so when this family member committed suicide, I had no idea like what happens after that. Mm-hmm. The only visuals I had was I had read Dante's Inferno, and
but not the rest, like it's a trilogy.
Yeah.
Okay.
And suicide was the ring of hell, where you turn into a tree, and there's little demons that come by and like snap your branches off for eternity, and you bleed every time one is snatched off. And I was an adult when this happened. I, of course, made a painting of a tree that had blood dripping off of it because I needed some sort of visual of what happened to my family member who I didn't know very well. I don't think that it affected me personally, but it was one of my dad's siblings. So I think watching him and listening to him, which he didn't do a lot of, he flew out for the funeral by himself, got through the funeral. He said a couple of things that were really like, because he just doesn't talk about emotions that much. But one thing he said at the funeral was, everybody at that funeral knew her better than I did. And that just sort of hit in a like, oh, damn, he regrets some stuff.
Right.
And it all feels like this, it's weird because it's a total separate situation, right? Where Elisa wasn't even a fully formed human being. But I want Olivia to have some sort of visual, whether she needs it or not. And maybe it's mostly for me. If I can present her with a story about what happened, I feel like I'm at least doing my job, and I won't regret anything if I'm able to put that sort of illustrated story in front of her, and then she can do with it what she wants.
Right. That makes sense. And like you said, like you want to do this thinking before you ask her to do it, right? Because you're not going to ask her to do something that you haven't at least tried to do or done your best job at doing. It strikes me, I mean, her visual is herself, right? Because her sister would have been her twin. And as you're saying, like may not have looked identical, probably would have had a different personality. And I've seen some sketches for the book, and I'm excited to see it.
It's strange. So one of the really tiny details about the house that we live in right now is it didn't come with mirrors, not even in the bathrooms. But I think it's sort of been a godsend because, I mean, we have a couple now because we bought some. It's been nice because I legit, every time Olivia looks into a mirror,
you see that you see the other one.
Yeah. She sits in front of the oven a lot because she can see herself reflected in the oven. And she doesn't quite talk to herself, but like she recognizes that that's her reflection. I don't know at 2 years old if she feels her twin in any of that when she sees her reflection, but I do. So I think that's going to be a part of the imagery that I put in there, because it for a long time, because the house that Olivia was born into was not this one. We lived in another house, and that one had mirrors. And every time I stood in front of the mirror, I was like, and holding her, I'd be like, I should have my other one too.
There should be another.
That kind of thing. Real life detail of just like not liking mirrors. The last thing I wanted to touch on was raising Olivia while honoring Elisa. I never feel like I'm doing enough to remember Elisa or remind people of Elisa, but at the same time, also feeling like my dead daughter is all I talk about. You've dealt with this, like you said, with losing a parent. How do you honor the dead while leaving the living as still the focus?
I don't know that my family has actually done incredibly well on that. I do want to say, like, I'm a big believer in ritual, whether it's like church service or something you make and do at home, because it allows us a completely different form of interaction than our, day to day. And for me, I feel I go to church and I'm involved in church because I do feel connected to something bigger than me. And that includes people who have died and who have passed on, and ancestors I didn't even know, really, quite frankly. So I wonder if there are little rituals that you guys will develop as a family, both as parents and then with Olivia. There's the joy of her birthday, but is there a part of that involves setting a place for Elisa at the table, or getting flowers and a special flower for Elisa or something like that? I like your idea of visual reminders, right? I'm sad that you don't have any pictures of Elisa, because I think you would otherwise live in a home where, if she had died when she was 2 or 3 or 4, you'd live in a house that was full of pictures of her, and those can be around. But sonograms sometimes look really weird.
So this is my Olivia journal, which Olivia daily journal. During and after COVID, it has not been a daily journal, but I'm at least trying to do like monthly, like what new words she's saying and all that stuff. And I do have, there is a little folder in here that does have the sonogram of both of them. I don't know which one is which, but these are the two placentas. I do have a visual. Obviously, it's not. This is it, but. And I'm keeping that because that's all I have. And something I talked with the midwife about was, so she wasn't huge. Elisa was probably the size of Plum or a Peach Pit or like whatever that app that you're using tells you at like 17 weeks.
I'll look it up.
When we had the C-section, they asked me, what do you want to do with Elisa? At the time, I felt like I just needed to focus on the kid that I had to now then like breastfeed and take home. And
right.
I think I just let the hospital have her. And we didn't have any tests done on the fetus or anything. Is a little bit of a regret because I wish I had, not that I want like a piece of the fetus, but I wish somebody had presented me with options of like, what can we do with her? I don't know. But at least I have that sonogram. It's something.
Yeah.
And I do like the idea of ritual. I think Pedro and I both are big on Christmas, right? Opening presents in the morning. And we're really excited to come up with our own. Because I know in my family, it was like presents between me and my sister. We opened on Christmas Eve, Christmas morning. I was the one that woke everybody up at 6 a.m. so that we could open presents. Because then we had to go over to my grandparents' house after we opened presents because they always cooked this like huge breakfast of like French toast and bacon and sausage and just like huge. So that was our ritual. So I think Pedro and I are still coming up with what ours is. We don't have a mantle. There's no fireplace. Like we don't need fireplaces here, so there are none.
Why would you have a fireplace?
Of like where to put things and when to hang things, and so we're still figuring out those rituals. So I do think fitting Elisa into that will feel, hopefully it will feel like second nature. And we do want to let Olivia dictate some of that once she gets older. The adoption process will take about a year. So hopefully by this time next year, we will have a second child. And I think beyond that, that's when our rituals can like really, really start. I think for right now, Elisa is a ritual I need to come up with. Pedro and I used to talk about it a lot because I would wake up in the middle of the night crying about it and he would sort of talk me through it. I haven't woken up in the middle of the night and cried about Elisa for a year. Maybe. So we haven't talked about her in a really meaningful way in a while. And I don't know how much he wants to be part of what I'm putting my brain through. I'm sure he'll go along with whatever.
And I've heard too, like for the parent who's not carrying the fetus, people also adopt, obviously. So then both parents aren't. But if one parent is pregnant and one parent is not, that for the parent who's not, shit doesn't really get real until much later in the pregnancy, right? Like no morning sickness, maybe a little sympathy gaining weight or something like that, living through some of the more uncomfortable gastrointestinal effects that we have talked about. But I'm sure he feels connected just in a different way. Both of you are really creative, hands-on type of people. So if you had gotten remains, right, you might have like a little urn or something, not on your mantelpiece because you don't have one, but on a shelf or something like that. Again, like I did a funeral for somebody whose body was donated to science. They could have had, I don't remember if they did, but a box or an urn or something like that, something special that little keepsakes could be put in. I don't know. You've already started to imagine what Elisa would look like. There could be a portrait of her or something like that, a way that she's kind of seamlessly integrated into your life. Like you said, is you also don't want to be the person who's like, always talking about her dead daughter. People just don't know how to talk about this stuff. Like when I tell people that I had a parent who died by suicide, it's been 25 plus years. Like I'm pretty okay. But sometimes like the person I tell it to is not okay. And I almost feel like I have to take care of them, which just makes me feel kind of pissy because I am the person that this happened to. Why do I have to like caretake for your feelings? But I think you set an example in the way that you talk about Elisa. Right. And you talk about her, you are clearly sad, but you are no longer, I should say, overwhelmed by these feelings. you create space to talk about her and honor her short little life.
I think it's just part of my personality and the art making. Like if I all of a sudden start putting out paintings of like a dead kid, I kind of have to explain it a little bit. And it's just like, I want everybody in my family to know, to not be afraid to bring her up. Because I do think that when I was younger, I was sensitive. I still am. But I think that sensitivity people confused for, oh, don't tell her. She'll get upset. Right. And I had no problems being upset. I wanted to be upset.
Right.
Tell me all the things.
I want to feel the feeling.
Yeah. And the fact that I was sheltered from a lot, I do think when I was growing up, I was not told things, or I was told things like much later after the fact, because people were afraid of my reaction. And I'm like, no, that is not how you're going to deal with me. Like, you're
right.
Tell me shit.
I don't think that's people being afraid of your reaction, but being afraid that they have to handle your reaction.
I fully want to feel all those feelings. It was Elisa's the only thing where I needed to stop blaming myself. I feel like with every other situation in my life, it either wasn't my fault or there was another person involved who was making decisions for me that I didn't appreciate or I didn't agree with. I had never experienced this before. There was nobody to like talk me out of it because the person I was missing had passed away.
And it all happened inside of your body, right?
Yeah.
Where you're like totally in the dark.
Why didn't I know? Why didn't the doctors know? At least in my situation, it was sort of this abstract. She was this big, she wasn't a full-term child, but at least in my situation, I did have a child to take home, which I do feel really lucky to have experienced that, because I do know other people who got pregnant with twins and lost both. I am horrified and heartbroken that I lost one of them. At least I got to take one home.
But also, yeah, so grateful. And it sounds like Olivia really helped you in the early days of your grief, just by giving you just through being a baby who needs that constant attention and that constant love, that she was able to pull you out of yourself. I want to say too, I think that reminded me, I know a couple who I think they're even a little bit younger than me, who lost their first baby to SIDS, just sudden infant death syndrome. And nobody knows why Grace died. And they've gone on to have 2 surviving children who are toddlers now. So at least out of the kind of danger zone for that. And I don't know them super well, but I know them well enough because one of the things that they do is every single year for Grace's birthday, they sponsor a toy drive for premature babies at the hospital where their daughter was born. Don't really vibe with the stages of grief theory, because I think people, and they weren't intended this way, right? But people make them line up like Candyland, right? You go from 1 to 2 to 3, and really it's just a mess, and it cycles and it comes and goes. But I think that there's something really healthy about when you take that and turn it outwards, right? The way that, and you're doing that in your storytelling and your art making and letting other people in. Again, it's going to be a way that Elisa's legacy stays alive, and she's always a part of your lives.
That's the reason I wanted to do these videos too, because when it happened, I did start looking online for a Facebook group or something, because nobody in my life had experienced this. They either had their twins or they lost both.
Right.
They weren't in this weird limbo that I felt like I was in. I researched and I found out that it's called Twinless twin. And then after speaking with the midwife, apparently what they would have called Elisa in medical terms was a twin extraction. So that is the medical term for one of my children. But the Facebook group that I did find, I asked to join just so I can know somebody else who went through this.
Right.
And the only response I got was, oh, this group is for parents of twinless twins who are 5 and up, because they've been told. It was for parents of kids who know and understand the twin that died. And I was like, okay, so I can't be a part of the group because my kid's 6 months old. And they're like, nope. Great. So I never found, so part of me doing these videos is because I never found any support other than some friends who were parents and maybe miscarried, so they understood partly what I was going through. And that's great. I mean, they did help me through it. I didn't, I don't have a therapist in Ecuador because I haven't been able to find one who is fluent in English. Because when you're in therapy, there's so many, I just didn't want anything to be lost in translation. I haven't done therapy since I lost Elisa, but I know I need it. This video series is me trying to work my way through it because one, I couldn't find support from parents who experience the same thing. And two, I don't have a therapist. You're serving that role right now, by the way.
Therapist, friend for hire. Sure.
Something new, yeah.
Well, and like, like I'm saying, like, it's also you like opening that grief outwards so that this can be a gift to someone else who knows, in a year or two, maybe someone will see this video and this will be exactly what they need. And whether or not they ever reach out and make themselves known to you, I think you can give yourself credit for making this available to somebody because it wasn't available to you.
I think that about wraps it up. So thank you for sitting with me and talking about some of this stuff. I still feel like I still have to figure out what to say besides lost.
What does died feel like to you? I meant to circle back to that.
I do like that better than lost because I feel like lost is something when you do when you're not paying attention or you're being, she died. It's factually correct. Mm-hmm. And I'm okay with saying she died. I do think when I start to talk to Olivia, I feel like I have to say she died because she's not here. She's not lost. We can't go to her. The word died that's it. There's nothing metaphorical about it. You can't think it any other way. And maybe you can, I don't know. But I feel like that word is like set in stone.
I mean, and that's why some people, I think, don't like it, right? Because they don't want to believe or accept the finality of it. But like we've talked about, like I have plenty of relationships with dead people in my life. My relationship with my father is no less complicated because he died when I was 11. In fact, it's a lot more complicated. It hasn't had additional incidents added to it in 25 years, but there's still some intense shit about it. But I do think that when you're speaking to Olivia, because you plan to do it when she is still fairly young, that's probably the better language to use.
Probably having difficulty navigating this because, and I forgot to mention this before, but I've lost, like, people in my life have died, but I haven't felt like I lost them because they weren't that close to me. Nobody that I need in my life has died. Like, they're all still living.
Yeah.
My dad's parents died when I was real young. I don't have any memories of them other than stories my dad has told. So part of this is just because I've never really had to deal with death. When my dad's sibling committed suicide, I was more concerned with him than my feelings around the person who committed suicide because I didn't know her that well.
Right.
So I think a lot of this is just like, I don't know how to deal with death. I've never had to do it. I've had people my age in my life die, but again, I wasn't super close to them. And it was just dealing with a death of a person that didn't really live in the first place, but is the twin of the kid you're raising. That's such a complicated, and everybody's going to deal with that differently.
It's so specific.
Yeah, I'm just still trying to navigate how I deal with it.
I mean, I will say, I think there's something to be said for, it's not like you get better at grief, but once you've gone through really intense grief, you kind of understand that you can get through it and that you will survive it, right? Like those feelings that feel unsurvivable. And not, again, to make this all about Olivia, but my mother had a brother and then a pair of twin siblings who died. And the twin siblings died they were born in the 60s. They had an RH mismatch with their mom. Like, they never made it out of the hospital. But her brother Larry died in his 20s. He was in the army. He was a doctor. and he got, I think, leukemia, some kind of cancer. But we talked about him growing up. Like I grew up, I never met my Uncle Larry. He died before I was born. But I understood that I had an Uncle Larry and that my mother had this brother. I wonder a little bit if he was her favorite brother, or if it's just like, he died so young, she's kind of always pissed off at one of her siblings, but she's never mad at Larry because he wasn't around to be mad at. I just remember finding it really profound. Like I would ask my mom, like, would you ever talk to Larry? Do you still feel him? And she said, yeah, sometimes I do. Or something happens and I wonder like how Larry would feel about this. And I think that's been helpful to me just because it modeled, right? Like talking about someone who's died, having a relationship with them, even though they've died. And I don't know, I mean, that plus a lot of therapy have been really helpful to me in navigating other deaths and sitting with families who have lost someone. I've actually seen people die like in hospitals and been there for final moments. And it's not like it gets easier with practice, but I think that you'll live through it. This happened before and I managed to get to the other side of it. So again, I think that's a gift that you'll give your daughter growing up and your other kids when they come into your life.
Well, and I love that you said you can still have a relationship with people who have passed, because I don't think that I recognized that until you just said it. And I guess I go back and forth between, are people going to think I'm morbid if I like talk to Elisa or hang a stocking that has Elisa's name on it? But I'm not going to give a fuck. I'm just going to do it. I need to.
Yeah. That's the right attitude, I think. Nobody has a roadmap for grief. There are lots of like therapy textbooks, but I think mostly they're just about avoiding getting stuck or unhealthy coping mechanisms. And nothing you're talking about is unhealthy, right? You're not drinking yourself into oblivion. You're not, going out and having risky sex, like all the self-destructive things that people do. This is just finding a healthy way to maintain your relationship with Elisa.
Yeah. And it's good to hear that I can still have one. And you talk about like it doesn't get better with practice, but you can get through it. Because I remember when we had the sonogram where we couldn't find her heartbeat anymore. And I guess this is why I have a visceral reaction to the word lost, because my OBGYN was in the room when we were getting our sonogram and she was searching for Elisa's heartbeat, and she just goes, "Oh, we lost one." That's literally how she said it. There was no like, "Okay, Amy,
oh my God,
can't find her heartbeat." It was just, "Oh, we lost one." So that, I think that was probably some context I should have put in there. But I remember like I was laid out on that bed after getting that sonogram, crying my eyes out. I'm sure everybody in the waiting room could hear me, but I was like, I'm never going to go over this. And I screamed that at the top of my lungs, like over and over and over again. Mm-hmm. And not that I'm over it, but the pain I think has subsided, and having all these conversations about nobody's to blame, nothing's to blame, there's nothing to blame. And I think even getting to that point took a really long time of just acknowledging that there is no blame in this situation. It's not because the OBGYN wasn't looking closely enough. It's not because I did anything to myself or my body to cause it. It's just, it is. So I think it took me a long time to get to that. But now that I'm past the pain part of it, like, I do look forward to having a relationship. I don't know what form that's going to take or how I'm going to do it, but I guess I just always thought of like, oh, person's dead, it's over, and it doesn't have to be over.
I preached a funeral recently where I said, in God's economy, nothing is lost because of that, right? Because this is a woman who died fairly young, and she had 3 teenage kids, and it was another like real wacky funeral, because I think that when people are grieving, like you said, like, fuck it, like you need to do what you need to do. And so 6 of her friends stood up and gave remembrances and all talked about how they were going to carry on her legacy and take care of her children for her, and they'd never forget her. And that's what I meant. Nothing lost. I think this is coming from a religious background, right? And like Christian, so like death and resurrection are kind of 2 sides of the same coin, but lost actually to me has this sense of you can never get that person back. Mm-hmm. And in that sense, yeah, she's not lost to you. She's gone, she's dead, but you can have a relationship and you can bring her into your home and she'll always have a place in your family. And you'll always be the mother of twins and then some other kids. And what a cool thing it will be for Olivia to have so many different siblings. Like she's just going to grow up feeling like, yeah, some like just knowing, some kids have such a narrow vision of how families are made. Right. And they don't understand, like people get their worlds rocked when they figure out adoption or foster care or same-sex couples having babies or stuff like that. But she's going to have a really expansive idea of what family is from the get-go.
I hope so. The generation that raised us had maybe your mom's a little different. There was very defined. And then like growing up in the South, it was like, if you're not married by 25, something's wrong with you. Hopefully Olivia will have, like you said, a very expansive view on family. And even if she doesn't want her own kids, having a partner and a dog still makes you a family,
I just think it has the potential to make her a much more empathetic and open-minded person. I guess that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's called, it reminds me of like the idea of like, it's called scripting, right? Like what you're saying is like, there's one narrative on how you live your life and, you're 25, you do this, you do that. And then if for whatever reason, that's not an option for you, there's a sensation of being lost in a sense of like, I can't follow the roadmap. But what's exciting about that is you do get to make it up yourself. Like the first lesbian wedding I did, first same gender wedding I did with two women, I was like, I've never done this before. I've done a lot of other weddings. So I can tell you what worked there, but I don't have a roadmap for you guys. And I want you to understand how exciting that is because we will really make the ceremony that works the best for you. And then they wanted something very traditional and heteronormative anyways. But, there's a world of possibility, I guess, that opens up when you're able to let go of the script and also get to the fuck it point where you're like, I'm going to do what I need to do. Okay. Before we go, I just want you to hear me say, like, I really admire you as a parent and I will be coming to you for advice. Okay. I think you're doing an amazing job. But even just to hear you say, like, you'll figure it out, I just really admire you and it means a lot when I hear you say that.
Yeah,
I want to hug you.
I'm so happy that you and Ellen are gonna have your own little baby. All right, thank you for doing this. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Really Thanks for I feel really honored to be a part of it, so thank you. Please give Pedro my best as always. I like that guy.
Yeah, he's a good one. Okay, I love you.
Me too. Bye.